Tonight on KQED Newsroom, one of California's leading weather scientists warns of a possible mega flood as a result of continuing climate change. UCLA's Daniel Swain joins us to discuss his new report. And Bay Area-based author Dave Eggers joins us to talk about one of his books being banned by a school district in South Dakota. We'll also talk with him and the other leaders of his nonprofit, 826 Valencia, which is celebrating 20 years of teaching youth how to write everything from science fiction to essays to poems.
It's a better version of school, a more fun version of school.
Plus, the vibrant colors and celebratory images of women working, leading, and creating in the Women's Building mural are this week's Something Beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco this Friday, August 19th, 2022. Hello and welcome. I'm Priya David Clemens, and this is KQED Newsroom. We have spoken regularly on this show about two threats from climate change, drought and wildfire. But this week, another threat took center stage, the mega flood. A new study indicates that California could be in for torrential storms that last for weeks, overwhelming rivers and causing havoc in urban areas. One of the study's authors, UCLA climate scientist Daniel Swain, joins us now by Skype from Boulder, Colorado. Daniel, thank you for joining us on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us more about the findings in your study.
Well, we know that California is actually a region that is subject to episodic pluvials or severe flood events throughout its geologic history. There's something that happened probably about 5 times per millennium or so maybe every 200 years. The last really big one was in 1862 and produced what came to be known as the Great Flood of 1862. We expect that climate change is significantly upping the odds. In fact, in this particular study, we find that climate change has essentially doubled the likelihood, at least, of seeing an event like that today relative to about a century ago, and that the warming that we're likely to see over the coming decades will further increase that risk. And just to be clear about what we're talking about, it's a weeks-long sequence of severe atmospheric river storms that bring perhaps 100 inches of rainfall in the mountains, or locally even more. So this is a very large amount of precipitation in a pretty short period of time that we're talking about.
So what does that look like? Can you paint a picture for us in urban areas, in wilderness areas? What happens with all of this additional rainfall?
Well, in this first phase of the broader project called ArcStorm 2.0, we looked mainly at the meteorological side of things. So how much rain, how much snow, how intense are the storms? Project's second phase is really going to focus on how much inundation there is, who gets flooded. We're actually working with the California Department of Water Resources to get a flood map for the entire state of California during these scenarios. So we'll have more detailed answers at that point. But I think, even now we can sort of sense where the big problems are going to arise. We know in 1862, when the Great Flood happened then, that the Central Valley, for example, turned into a temporary inland sea nearly 300 miles long, and coastal bayshore parts of what's now the San Francisco Bay Area were inundated, as well as much of now heavily populated Los Angeles and Orange counties. These are places now where millions of people have their homes and businesses, as well as the home for many of California's major transportation arteries and major industries. So this would be a hugely disruptive event. Today we have about 40 million people living in places where there were about 400,000 or 500,000 people in 1862. So it's a much larger population potentially living in harm's way. We also have modern flood control infrastructure that would somewhat mitigate the risk. So it's sort of this tension between far more people being in harm's way today than there were the last time an event of this magnitude happened, tempered somewhat by the fact that we do have modern flood control systems in place, dams and levees. The big question is, to what extent would our existing flood control infrastructure be able to stand up to a storm sequence of this magnitude? And I think that's still a bit of an open question that we're sort of working with various partners to answer at the moment. But suffice it to say, it would be a very disruptive event, a very costly event, and would probably change the face of California forever.
When does your study predict that this sort of flooding could start to occur?
Well, it's already possible. We know it's possible even absent climate change, of course, because it happened in 1862, most recently, before there was human-caused climate change to any significant degree. So we know that it's already possible. It could happen in any given year. But it's, of course, more likely now with warming than it once was, and it will be more likely still in the future with another degree or so of warming that we're likely going to experience. We estimate that right now the risk in any given year is perhaps 1 in 50, which is up from about 1 in 100 a century ago. But what that means is that the cumulative risk over the next 30 to 40 years rises as high as 50 to 60%. So perhaps more likely than not, we'll see a mega flood event of some magnitude over the next 30 to 40 years. And so it's more likely than not that most of us will experience at least one of these events in our lifetime.
I'd like to ask you about a couple pieces of legislation. Congress just passed the most significant climate change investment ever as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. They also passed an infrastructure bill last year. How much will that money, that investment, head off this danger?
Well, I think it's a bit of an open question. Obviously, the less warming there is, the less the risk increase there will be from events like this. But even with these relatively new and fairly optimistic carbon emission reduction proposals and policies, including these recent legislative actions that have taken place on the national scale, global warming is fundamentally a global problem. And so it's not just a question of what the United States or what California does, it's really a question of what the whole world does. And even now, we're still on a path to roughly double the amount of warming that we've already seen, if not more, even with these recent legislative decisions and climate accords. So there's still a lot of warming that is likely to occur in the coming decades on our current path, even though that's somewhat less warming than appeared likely a decade ago. So there will be further risk increases. The other side of the question, though, is how much will these sorts of infrastructure funding bills allow us to partially adapt to these risks. So upgrade flood control, restore natural floodplains, add new river bypasses, do things that might help reduce the risks to people when these events do eventually occur. And I think that's a more interesting question in the short term, because there is significant potential that these sorts of infrastructure funding bills, if we end up allocating the funds in that direction, could help mitigate significantly some of these risks. So I think that too is an open question, but one that may have more short-term relevance, because it really depends on how we choose to allocate those funds.
Daniel, will this additional rain help to mitigate the problems that we have with drought and wildfire?
Well, the interesting thing is, it actually may not end up being additional rain. What we find is that in a warming climate, California's precipitation neither increases nor decreases very much on average. So we're seeing more intense evaporation because of warming temperatures. That's the main reason we're seeing worse droughts and worse wildfires. But on the other hand, we see shorter but sharper bursts of precipitation. And so this is sort of in line with that idea that the risk of drought and flood is likely increasing at the same time, simultaneously in California. So it might help mitigate short-term droughts if there is a drought occurring, of course, when this event, a mega flood event actually happens. But in the long run, it doesn't really reduce our risk of drought. In fact, there is still a long-term trend towards increasing water scarcity in the Southwest, even in an era of increasing risk of extremely severe flood events. So we're actually going to have to learn how to co-manage these risks simultaneously. There are some ways we can help to reduce the risk of, or the consequences of drought, by harnessing floodwaters potentially to help us recharge groundwater aquifers, so diverting some of these episodic flood flows so that they don't flood cities but instead recharge our depleted aquifers. That's one such example of ways we could allocate certain sorts of infrastructure spending to accomplish those goals. But in a warming climate, we do expect there to be increasing, we call it precipitation whiplash, those increasingly wide swings between extremely wet conditions on the one hand that we're talking about in this mega flood work, but also extremely dry conditions on the other hand, work that we've discussed previously. So we're going to continue to see both ends of the spectrum in a warming climate.
Climate scientist Daniel Swain, thank you for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.
Let's turn now to education. The American Library Association says librarians in every state are facing an unprecedented number of attempts to ban books in schools and public libraries. One of those books is The Circle, written by well-known Bay Area author Dave Eggers. Eggers is also the co-founder of 826 Valencia, where students learn critical writing skills, like this thank you poem.
Thank you, brave Julie Maxon. You are a hero because you always make your patients smile. I can hear the patients laughing and smiling around you. Thank you, brave Julie Maxon. You always make sure patients have the support they need to be resilient. I smell the flowery bloom of roses next to you.
The nonprofit is now celebrating its 20-year anniversary. Co-founder Dave Eggers joins us now, along with co-founder and veteran public school teacher Nínive Calegari, and the current executive director, who's also taught for many years, Vida Nazarian. Thank you all for being here with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and you've brought a wealth of books.
Tons.
So tell me what's here.
Well, these are, from the beginning, Nínive and I thought that we had to honor student work. I mean, students were writing poems, were writing short stories, were writing their own narratives, and we wanted to make them, codify them, make them, worthy of being in a library, sold in stores, give them a professional treatment because to honor the work, to amplify it.
So these are all books that were written by students and published through, is it McSweeney?
Published by us.
Yeah.
No, well, McSweeney's, at the beginning, McSweeney's and 826 were all piled into the same space.
Okay.
So professional authors and youth were working side by side, and the authors were getting their work published. And so we were able to, at the very same time, publish youth work. One of my dreams was always, and we distributed the books. So one of my dreams was that a young person would walk into City Arts and Lectures and show their friend their name and the table of contents, but we know youth don't have tons of money, so they would just leave the book at City Arts and Lectures, but at least be honored. And what happens also when we celebrate the books after is the youth walk around for about at least a couple weeks around 10 feet tall. Like becoming a published author is a really incredibly big deal. I used to also say that I would feel so proud every time a book came out, which was frequently that I wanted to wear it as a necklace because it's such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful symbol of this great accomplishment. And youth don't just write slapdash something and then we publish it. They work really hard. And what teachers told us is that for books, we could get the youth to write 8 to 12 drafts. So it really gets into the craft and the hard work that real authors do.
And so, Vida, tell us a little bit about how this organization is working in San Francisco right now, because you've broadened out from that one first storefront with the pirate shop in the front and the writing in the back to other centers as well, and you work with local schools.
Right. So 826 Valencia is our name and our address in the Mission District, and started 20 years ago, that one center, several schools. Now we've expanded our programming. We have 3 centers. There's one in the Tenderloin, there's one in Mission Bay, and about a dozen schools that we serve. And basically what the secret sauce is one, you saw the books, right? What happens to a young person where they go from saying, I hate writing, to I'm a published author. Then we have a partnership model where we're very responsive to every community that we serve. So we don't have a cookie cutter approach. It really depends on the child, the community, and the school. And then we also have this spirit of joy and whimsy that is really unique to 826 in that we have a supply store for pirates. So if you have a peg leg that you need, or a plank, or scurvy be gone, you could come to our store and go shopping. But that spirit of joy permeates all our work together with the young people and kind of inspires the creativity that comes through in the writing.
Okay, well, you know what? We do have a little clip from a student talking about a creative writing story that he's working on, a comic book actually. So why don't we go ahead and roll that? That's some of that spirit of creativity, and come back and keep talking about it.
Going into the future, I made it like a virtual reality, and then they go on the adventure. They kill the villain of the virtual reality. It's King Savage. The twist is that actually the friend's the evil one, and the King Savage was actually trying to help him.
So, Dave, when you started this with Nínive 20 years ago, what was the need that you saw then? Why was literacy, obviously you're an author, but why was literacy such a gaping need, and which seems to continue?
Well, my mom was a teacher. A lot of my best friends were teachers, became teachers here in the Bay Area, and they kept saying that for the students that were falling behind, the students that were reluctant readers, reluctant writers, they needed more one-on-one attention. And if a teacher had 120 students a day, they didn't have that 2 hours per student to give. So they said if they could only clone themselves, if they could have more caring adults to shine a light on work and students one-on-one, then they could keep kids at grade level or even make, passionate writers out of them. And we happen to know a lot of writers, copy editors, authors, journalists that had some extra time. So we just sort of combined the need and this waiting army of available tutors. And it's still that way today. It's that simple. It's humans sitting next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, working on the writing on the page. And that need will never go away, I don't think. And the passion that the kids have to be heard for 2 hours at a time from this one community member that just wants them to succeed, it'll never change. So 20 years, it's exactly the same formula that it was way back when. We've expanded in a lot of different ways, but that basic one-on-one formula is exactly the same.
And I actually, can I add to that?
Please.
I actually had 146 students, and it was impossible ever, and Beta also comes from the classroom, it was impossible ever to give them the attention that I thought that they deserved. And I didn't know that there was this creative class. When I was when I was teaching, I was super serious, and I was hunkered down and trying to meet everyone's needs in the school setting. And what Dave knew that I didn't know is that there was this creative class that was willing to pitch in and help. And I think one of the things that makes me proudest is from the very beginning, we wanted to work at teachers' behest, wanted to make sure their dreams were coming true. When we asked them about what projects they always wanted to do but didn't have the resources or the bandwidth to do it. And we were able to say, well, that project, if we paid for the books, if we paid for the publishing, we paid for the party, and we brought in the tutors, and we did it, how does that sound? And the teachers would be incredibly excited. And you asked earlier about the growth. As we grew, which was rapid, one of the things is we couldn't be at every single center at every point all around the country. But we always asked teachers, would you work with us again, and would you recommend us to another teacher? And one of the things that always made me feel incredibly proud is that even all around the country, they would finish up the project and we would ask them, will you work with us again? Would you recommend us? And the answer was always yes. And so as the growth happened, we were really assured that what we were doing is also making sure that teachers' lives were better, easier, more fulfilled.
And you also have more than 70 other centers around the country that have kind of modeled themselves around the world that have modeled themselves off of you. Beta, tell us about the state of literacy and the concerns that we all should be aware of.
Right. I mean, I think the state of literacy is very dire right now. In the state of California, about 40% of third graders are at grade level in English language arts, 40%. And then, meanwhile, there's research about the fact that third grade reading proficiency predicts whether or not you graduate from high school, and we know that correlates to financial stability. So it's really dire. But beyond that, like, nobody, when they talk about literacy, talks about writing. And I want to just say we must talk about writing. Writing is essential to access and understanding every single discipline that's taught. But it's way more than that. It's how we market and sell goods. It's how we tell the truth in media. It is how we write our laws. It is how we build community, empathy, etc. So writing's this essential skill, and it's not taught.
Well, I want to turn now to talk about some writing that's being banned and is not being available to everyone. So Dave, one of your books, The Circle, was banned in South Dakota. And I've been reading through it. From what I can see, there are some short sex scenes that seem like those might have triggered a ban. I don't see anything else. Is that what it was?
Yeah, I think mine was the least important of the books that were banned. Usually these days the challenges have gone exponentially up in the last few years, and most of them they're banning books that teach alternative narratives and alternative stories that usually aren't told, and LGBTQ stories and CRT stories, and they're trying to squelch and silence these narratives. And usually they'll pick out
CRT, critical race theory.
Yeah, they'll try to figure out, they'll try to find a passage or two that is semi-offensive in some superficial way, and then they'll throw the rest of the book away. And so these challenges and these bans are, we know of a few thousand of them every year, but I think that there's far more. It's a movement to silence these stories, and I think that it's a battle that's just begun at this new stage, because I think that they're becoming very clever at finding ways to take these books from the shelves, and I think we have to battle it, foot by foot, yard by yard. It's going to be a thing in this next decade that we have to be vigilant.
Well, let me put some meat on the bones of those numbers you were mentioning. To be specific, the American Library Association says nearly 1,600 books were challenged in 2021, double the challenges from the year before, and the highest number they've seen since they began tracking 20 years ago. How did you respond to your book being banned?
Well, I got in touch with the other authors. There were 5 of us that were pulled from the shelves in this Rapid City school district. And the first thing we did, we got in touch with Mitzi's, the local independent bookstore, and we made an arrangement where any students that were affected, any seniors in high school that had been assigned these books, but then they were pulled from the shelves, could go into Mitzi's and get these books for free. So we sold over 400 books. So all of the seniors that were affected got free copies of all 5 books, and they were much more intrigued by these books.
They were more interested, right?
So there's always this unintended effect when you ban a book, you make it very intriguing.
Silver lining.
So, it takes, that community is an amazing place. Rapid City is a great town. The teachers, but it goes back to teachers, because again, these teachers were challenged in all of their choices during COVID. They're challenged in their choices of reading material. Now these transparency laws are coming in, where parents or these school districts are saying everything that the teacher teaches has to be pre-approved. So again and again, we're making it difficult to be a teacher, to stay in that profession. And so the rest of us that support teachers have to do everything we can to give them the freedom and give them the autonomy that they deserve.
I'm curious, with banning books, do you think that there is content that shouldn't be in high school libraries and public libraries?
Not in libraries. Everything must be in the library. If the Bible's in the library, then Perks of Being a Wallflower should be in the library. And the Supreme Court has ruled this again and again, that you can't pull a book from the library just for being offensive to some people. That was many different case law. There's a lot of case law about that. In terms of assigning the books, there are some books that shouldn't be assigned to a 13-year-old. They're not ready for the content. But in Rapid City, these kids were 18 years old. They were seniors in high school. They're about to go out in the world, and they are ready to have a few pages of sexual content in context. Every book, including the Bible, has plenty of sexual content in it.
Your book is going to sell massively now. I mean, it's already a bestseller, but now, and I know the sex scene because I read it, and I think that you're going to this is going to make this book incredibly popular. But for me, it's just so sad, because we do the opposite at 826. I remember vividly asking young people, do you have an important story to tell? And before we worked with them, many youth said that they did not have an important story to tell. And after writing themselves into existence and then us celebrating that story and spending a lot of time just listening to them, they will understand, like, I do have an important story to tell, like where I come from and who I am and how I see the world is something of value to the community. And so it's so frustrating.
Yeah, one of the students we talked with there spoke about the joy that she has in just being there and being with other students. Let's take a listen to that.
I really enjoy everybody here. Everybody's so nice, and we all really have a fun time with each other.
Vida, tell me about that experience that the students have and the empowerment that they feel.
Yeah, I think, they start out sometimes saying, I'm not a writer, and then they turn into, I'm a published author, and 10 feet tall, right? And I think it's really the joy that we bring, that individualized attention, and this spirit of my story is important and I can do it. That's what we do.
And validating even the strangest ideas they might have. Isaac had a very unusual story that he wrote, and when we say, when they write a story about 8-legged space aliens that want to start a ballet company, And we say, that sounds good. Let's
Great.
polish
Right.
it. We're
Give
going to
them
publish it.
all of those
And
opportunities.
there's that shock, like, really?
Yeah.
It's, because sometimes
All
I
right,
think
we're
that they
going to
think,
have to
yeah.
look at those books for those, so everybody can read those stories in these books that you publish. Dave, Nínive, Vida, thank you for joining
Thanks for
us.
having
Thanks so
me.
much.
Thank you so much.
A home for emerging women-led projects since 1979, the San Francisco Women's Building is covered in a vibrant mural celebrating the accomplishments of female role models. Completed in 1994, the mural depicts the likes of Georgia O'Keeffe and Rigoberta Menchú, alongside Aztec and Chinese goddesses. As one of the first women-owned and operated community centers in the country, more than 170 organizations trace their roots here. And it's this week's Something Beautiful. Such warm and welcoming images. I'm going to have to take a stroll there. That's the end of our show for tonight. You can find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, or email us at knr@kqed.org. And you can reach me on social media at Priya D. Clemens. Thank you for joining us. We will see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend.